Welcome to JS on Politics, a weekly look at what's happening in Wisconsin politics, and this week, of course, what's happening in national politics. Here's a quick look at what's ahead on our show today. The presidential circus has moved on to New Hampshire. We'll take a look at Tuesday's primary. If you watch our show, you probably know who Ron Johnson is, but what about the 4 in 10 voters who don't know enough to form an opinion, and what does that mean for the race this fall? We'll take a look at a suddenly open House seat and talk about the latest happenings in Madison. And, of course, we'll take some of your questions. But to begin and to sort of set the table for us, we're going to go to a taped segment with Craig Gilbert, who at this very moment is probably about to see Donald Trump in New Hampshire. So we taped this bit a little bit earlier this morning. All right, we're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington Bureau Chief, who is on the ground in New Hampshire preparing for a Donald Trump rally. Craig, tell us a little bit, set the stage a little bit for our viewers and listeners. What's the difference in the electorate between Iowa and New Hampshire? These are very different states in many ways, aren't they?
Yeah, they do share a very white electorate, but there's some big differences. The biggest difference in some ways is that New Hampshire is a primary where it's the biggest turnout primary in the country, and it has been for many cycles, which is the precise opposite of Iowa, where because of the caucus system, even in a big year, like in a big turnout like we saw last week, it's still a really small percentage of the eligible voters that are actually participating. So New Hampshire is a much broader electorate in that respect. And then when you look at the parties, particularly on the Republican side, the Republican electorate is much different. You don't have anywhere near the population of evangelicals you had in Iowa. It's a more secular kind of economic conservatives, in some cases sort of hawkish conservatives. Very different there. That has big implications for the Republican candidates. And on the Democratic side, obviously you have the senator next door, Bernie Sanders, which is one reason why he's favored here.
All right. Well, one of the adages in politics is there's 3 tickets out of Iowa. We know who kind of got those tickets, but who has the most at stake here in New Hampshire now a week later?
Well, Bernie Sanders really has to win because he's been way ahead in the polls, and this is a good state for him. If he loses New Hampshire, which doesn't seem like it's likely to happen, that would just be a massive, massive blow for him. Hillary Clinton is just trying to close the gap and finish respectably here. On the Republican side, a lot of people are facing elimination. You've got a trio of governors, John Kasich, a former governor, Jeb Bush, and Chris Christie, who are scrambling for their lives, and they have to do something in New Hampshire to keep going. They were not factors in Iowa. Donald Trump has to win New Hampshire because he's been ahead here. Marco Rubio would like to beat out the governors, and Ted Cruz is not expected to do necessarily that well here, so the pressure is off of him a little bit.
All right, so if you look at the polls, Trump is a big leader on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side. So talking about the Democrats, how close does Hillary Clinton have to make it, do you think, or is she just a matter of putting in an effort and waiting for South Carolina and more favorable states?
Yeah, it's really more psychological than anything else. She could lose by 10 or 15 points and it would be a psychological blow to her campaign, but then she goes to South Carolina, where the electorate is much better for her because she's better known and does much better than Bernie Sanders does right now with African American voters. In these southern states, they're a huge part of the Democratic vote. So she's going to start winning primaries unless something strange happens after New Hampshire. But it'll affect the psychology of the campaign, what her losing margin is if she loses New Hampshire. And on the Republican side, it's like I said, there are people facing elimination. We've already winnowed the field down to 9 from 17. It still favors Donald Trump to have so many people fragmenting the vote. And there's a lot of competition for those sort of more mainstream, pragmatic Republicans. There's going to be a big independent vote. We don't know which party it's going to materialize in. So lots of wild cards. Yeah,
well, on the Republican side, it's hard to see, I guess, more than one of the governors that you mentioned, making it out in New Hampshire. Is there one who seems has the most energy or best organization out there that we should be watching for?
Well, John Kasich has sort of been that candidate, it seems like, for a long time. It's an open question, though, as to whether he can seal the deal. And there's a lot of, aggressive attacks being made within this crowd. The Bush people are fighting the Rubio campaign and fighting the Kasich campaign, and the Christie people are going after Rubio. Because of the very thing you just said, which is that they're all in competition with each other, particularly these 3 governors and former governors. And so they're training their fire on each other, even though they share a lot of things politically.
All right, well, we'll leave it there for today. Please follow Craig Gilbert's coverage from New Hampshire at jsonline.com, and we'll have you back next week to talk about what happened in New Hampshire. Thanks, Craig.
Look forward to it.
All right, we're back live. Let me introduce our panel. We've got Bill Glauber, who's one of our political reporters, Mary Spicuzza, another of our political reporters, and from Madison, Jason Stein. And Jason, we're going to talk a little bit more about New Hampshire and take a bit even of a closer look. But who in your mind has the must-win or at least must-win place or show out there to really carry on in the campaign?
I don't know that anyone's got a must-win situation, but I think the person that everyone would be watching most closely would be Donald Trump. Obviously, he had a little bit of a disappointing showing in Iowa. He's expected to win New Hampshire. So the question would be, does he win? Does he win with the kind of authority that is expected? Do his people fail to show up? And again, so far we've been thinking about this, like, is this a really unusual, unprecedented election season where Donald Trump has shaken everything up? If he kind of peters out, we're into more of a traditional type campaign where you have a little bit more of an establishment candidate, Marco Rubio, and a conservative challenger in Ted Cruz. If Trump continues on and gets some new strength out of New Hampshire, then that storyline about an unusual election picks up again.
All right, well, let me ask the folks here on the set. So certainly it seems like Jeb Bush has to be in the top
Jeb
three,
Bush,
doesn't he?
we could potentially be looking at the end of the Bush dynasty, at least the current end, if Jeb Bush doesn't do reasonably well in New Hampshire and is able to get on to South Carolina. I think the pressure will probably be on Jeb Bush. And, of course, Chris Christie, John Kasich, and Marco Rubio are kind of fighting for that establishment position.
Well, on the Republican side, it seems like, Trump's got a big lead. Is it safe to say that Trump and Rubio are two of the top three, and who's left?
I think Rubio had a strong showing in Iowa, and I think he's going in with a lot of momentum. Obviously, Cruz won, but I think that a lot of establishment Republicans are on their knees praying that Rubio does better this time around.
All right, so let's talk about these things come out a lot of times to the expectations game. So what kind of margin would Trump win by? Our panel, I could say I don't have high expectations for Bill. I have high expectations for Mary. We'll see how they even out. But who's most likely to beat the expectations, do you think, and get that juice? Because Rubio was in third, but he did much better than expected, and he's seen as the big winner in Iowa.
I wouldn't, at this stage, I don't think you can play the expectations game yet because, 4 or 5 days is a long time in New Hampshire, and you have independents who are able to vote back and forth, Republican or Democrat. So anybody who says they know how this thing's going to shake out doesn't really know, because New Hampshire is volatile. It's always been that way. Remember, Hillary came back after losing to Obama, and as the Obama people said, they were ready to dictate the terms of surrender to her, and boy, she won that primary in 2008, and they were off to the races all summer long.
All right, so I think Bill just beat expectations. What did you?
Man. So I think that if Rubio does well in New Hampshire, that is very, very, very bad news for Jeb Bush. I think that his campaign is kind of on life support, and I just don't see, unless he has a really strong showing, I don't see how he's really going to keep moving forward. So do you want me to keep going, or is that okay for expectations?
Do you think Mary's doing okay here?
No, I think
Help me out,
right.
Stein.
I mean, obviously, with South Carolina being so close to Florida, he'd like to continue on, right? But at a certain point, a disappointing showing means for him that the establishment that has, supported him, financially so strongly through last year starts to lean on him and say, more heavily and say, please clear the way for Marco Rubio to save us here, because obviously they have concerns about the other contenders.
All right, let's shift gears now and talk about the U.S. Senate race. Bill, you had a story in the paper today about Senator Ron Johnson, who apparently is the least known current senator in a while for us. But what's your takeaway on that? If people don't think much of him to make an opinion.
Yeah,
come on, you know what it is.
It's 40% of the electorate or the surveyed people according to the Marquette University Law School poll. They didn't know enough about Johnson to render either a favorable or unfavorable about him. It was 25% for Russ Feingold, who of course had an 18-year career before losing to Johnson in 2010. I mean, this is, kind of normal. He's a first-term senator. And, by the end of the race, 100% of people who vote are going to know both of those guys. And as I like to say about this race, pitchers and catchers haven't even reported to spring training yet. They're going to go through a whole baseball season and crown a World Series champion before people actually vote in this race. So there's a long time. But in a more serious vein, what it means is that Johnson can reintroduce himself to the voters, but also Russ Feingold's people can reintroduce Ron Johnson to the voters. So you want to have control of your own narrative, and that's probably the important thing for Johnson going forward, is to control his narrative, who he is, what he stands for, and to make that pitch to the voters before Feingold does.
As sort of a point of reference, I mean, I think the same poller, Charles Franklin, when just prior to being named the vice presidential candidate, something like 35% couldn't form an opinion of Paul Ryan, who had been in office much longer than Ron Johnson. So is this an opportunity for Ron Johnson, or an opportunity for Russ Feingold? How do you see it, Mary?
I think this is going to be a very tough election for Ron Johnson. It's a presidential year, typically very high voter turnout in places like Milwaukee, which lean Democrat. So I think or at least his staff, have to be pretty nervous. He can reintroduce himself to voters, and he's going to have to try to probably moderate his image, because he does have a very strong conservative track record in D.C., and if he's trying to appeal to Dems or independents, I don't think he wants to just push, that track record.
All right, Jason, let me ask you. I'm not going to ask you to predict if the Brewers are going to win the World Series this year, although that might be an easy one. But,
yes.
But looking at this race, do you think it's going to turn more on the personalities of the candidates, the outside spending, presidential turnout? I mean, what are the factors here that are most important as we think about this election?
Yeah, you can put me down for a no on the Brewers. Sorry about that. Do you think on Ron Johnson, maybe it's just the goatee lately that's got people a little confused? Maybe if he shaved it, that would...
Well, no, he did shave it. That was a no-shave November thing.
Okay, there you go. So we know it's not that...
We think you should wear a goatee next time.
Okay,
Be careful
I'll get to work on that. As far as, going forward, I really expect, as bitterly divided as this state is politically, that as the presidential election heats up, as Ron Johnson and Russ Feingold get more associated with their party's nominees for president, I think you'll see that race tighten. It's got to tighten. But the challenge for Ron Johnson is, given that Wisconsin usually goes Democrat in the presidential election, how does he manage to outperform his party's nominee in this election cycle? Because he may need to do that to remain in office.
All right, we're going to leave that discussion there and turn now to a tape piece that sets up the open U.S. House seat that nobody this time last week was probably anticipating. The fall elections, at least at the congressional level, got a little more interesting this week when three-term Congressman Reed Ribble, a Republican, said he would not seek a fourth term. That surprised many, since Ribble, who defeated a Democratic incumbent in the Republican wave of 2010, had pledged to serve no more than 8 years, not 6. His decision creates a scramble among state lawmakers looking to move up, plus the district, which includes Green Bay, is considered a swing part of the state. There's one person we know who is not running, Steve Kagan, the allergist who Ribble beat in 2010. He says he's in private practice and happy there and won't run again. On the Republican side, State Rep. John Nygren of Marinette is considering a run. He's co-chair of the legislature's Budget Writing Committee. And Chad Weiniger, a former state lawmaker who is Brown County administrator, is looking at running for the seat. On the Democratic side, Outagamie County Executive Tom Nelson, a former state lawmaker who served as Assembly Minority Leader, is also considering a run, and of course many others are mulling it. But remember, Ribble, a roofer, was not an elected official when he ran, so who knows who will emerge as candidates in the end. All right, we're back live and joined by Dan Bice, one of our political columnists, Watchdog columnists. Dan, let's start with you on this one. So we've got an open seat, but there's been redistricting since Reed Ribble won. Is that favorable to the Republicans now? Is it going to be as much of a toss-up as it was in the past? It used to kind of go back and forth, election to election.
I think Republicans are worried that this is now a seat that's in play. If Reed Ribble had stayed in, it would definitely, or almost definitely, be a Republican seat. But it's going to be a lot of newcomers running for this position. And so I think there were two surprises this week in that district. First, that Reed Ribble wasn't going to run for re-election, and then Republicans were hoping Senator Roth would run for a seat, and then he's announced yesterday that he's not going to run either. So they're going to be digging to try to find a candidate to run, whereas on the Democratic side, everybody's expecting Tom Nelson to run again.
Yeah, Jason, you did a story earlier this week on this and looked at some of the potential names out there. Who do you think is most likely to get in on the Republican side?
I mean, there's always a lot of people that think about a seat like this opening, especially when it's unexpected. You've got John Nygren, who's the chairman of the state's budget committee, which is meeting today. By the way, I'll get a chance to ask him what he's thinking about. Somebody that doesn't get talked about a lot but is out there is Mike Gallagher, who is the national security advisor to Scott Walker in his short-lived presidential campaign. You have as well Chad Weininger, former state representative who's now the administration director in Brown County. He's former staffer for the Congressman Mark Green in that district. He's taken a look at it. So, there are other state lawmakers like Senator Frank Lassay kicking the tires. So, there's a big field right now. It'll whittle down to a few people over the next week or two.
I think the two that you mentioned that are most interesting, John Nygren, because he's well liked within the party. He was there for the fight on Act 10, and he's gotten some name recognition in the area. And then two is Mike Gallagher, who's only 31, hasn't run for office before, but he has some money, and apparently I've been told by party leaders that he has some supporters in the district saying that they'll back him if he runs.
He also has some military service and some service as an aide on Capitol Hill, is my understanding. So, he has those things that he can also point to, though he's a young man, but he has done some things that voters might value.
And Nygren's had some bipartisan bills, like all of his heroin and drug bills that he's, talked openly about his daughter's struggle with addiction. And so I think he's actually, done some bipartisan outreach that other Republicans haven't.
In your mind, Mary, how quickly does someone have to get a campaign put together? I think most people thought 2 more years for Ribble, and they were maybe anticipating a run in 2 years rather than just a few months.
I feel like pretty quick. I mean, this, especially if somebody's trying to lay claim to the seat, you kind of want to start getting out there early.
I think it depends on how much money you have. I mean, Ron Johnson showed you could get in May in an election year, and as long as you're pouring $9 or $10 million, that was obviously a Senate seat, but if you have money, it makes a big difference. I'm assuming there'll be an effort to try to consolidate and get behind one of the candidates pretty soon. So that would drive people to make decisions quickly.
All right, let's turn now to what's happening in Madison today. And Jason, can you give us a sense of what's on the agenda? I know Joint Finance is meeting, and the governor is saying don't spend too much more given the budget. But what do you think is going to happen today and in the coming days in Madison?
Sure. I mean, we just have a rush torrent of legislation that different authors are trying to get through the legislature in the final days. Today, the Budget Committee is taking up bills to deal with substance abuse, dementia, mental health, and it's a question of, it's not a lot of money that they want to spend, several $1 million, but the budget is pretty tight right now. We've got legislation that's also sitting out there on making college debt more affordable for students and families. The governor just signed 20 bills a few minutes ago, including one to make Wisconsin, I believe, the first state to allow deer hunters to wear blaze pink. So now the big question is whether Mary's going to buy me a pink ball cap for next deer season.
You already have one.
I mean, that's what's going on today.
All right. Well, of those issues, I mean, we had just a very short time in this legislative session. Mary, do you think it becomes a challenge if the lawmakers all pass their bills and the governor says, well, we can't afford all of them and he's got to pick and choose, or will they get this resolved somehow before it gets to that point?
I'm guessing he'll probably have some conversations with Speaker Voss and Fitzgerald about what bills he actually wants to get to his desk. That said, that Voss and Fitz have a lot of power now and they might not listen. But I think that any bill that gets introduced from here on out is going to have a very hard time of even getting to the floor for a vote, and they're really going to have to whittle down. I think the Speaker's staff told me that there are going to be 70 bills up on February 9th, and they want to be done by the 18th.
So how relevant do you think Governor Walker is right now on these discussions?
You know, I don't want to say he's irrelevant, but while he was off campaigning, Voss and Fitz were really running the legislature, and he's back, and it still kind of seems like they're running the legislature, and he's obviously trying to have a presence again, but I don't think that he has the sway that he had back when, 2011, 2012, obviously.
All right, now we have Mary on the record saying that she's not going to buy Jason a pink
I am.
hat.
No, I am.
Dan, you are. So
I don't have to.
You don't have to. So Jason,
T-shirt.
when it's deer season in September, in November, we'll have you on the air with your
Maybe
Blaze
I can go
pink
with
hat.
it.
All blaze pink.
You've got extra guns, don't you?
I do. We'll
I don't
talk
think
more
any-
about that. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah. All right, let's shift gears and slip in a little bit of discussion on a column you had this morning, Dan, on
Two of our favorite
politicians. It could be a regular segment, Clarke versus Abeley. Now, Clarke seemed to win his battle, and he did, at the county board, and now he's going to court on it.
Actually, you wrote the story about it last fall. He came in, Sheriff Clarke came in and asked for an increase in his budget, and Chris Abele decided to cut it by, $9 million? And the county board restored $4 million, and Chris Abele decided to cut that again through a budget veto, and
Which got overridden.
15-1. And in his veto message, Chris Abele said that he didn't want to support somebody who was saying a lot of incendiary stuff about Black Lives Matter, a number of other things. And that was very upsetting to Sheriff Clarke. Sheriff Clarke said that he was going to sue, and this last week he went ahead and sued.
And what the case was that he's infringing on, that Abele is infringing on Clarke's First Amendment rights.
Which is
We've never
amazing
seen
that
Clarke
there's
have
any
an
restriction
inability to-
on what Sheriff Clarke is saying. He seems to. I was just running through. He's got a podcast. He's got Twitter. He's got press releases. He's got Facebook. He's got everything. He's talking in lots of directions, but apparently he feels like his free speech rights were impinged upon. So it's essentially a lawsuit trying to get a judge to tell Chris Abele that he's got to follow the Constitution, which is something he upholds every time he's elected. He's on the ballot again, so I'm assuming he'll swear that he's going to do it. But it'll be good publicity for Sheriff Clarke, at least for a little while.
So who picks up the cost on this for the attorneys? Now, you can have an
When a
attorney for
county
Clarke, you
official-
can have an attorney for Abele, you got
when
a
a
judge.
county
you got-
official sues another county official, then it's usually the county taxpayers who end up bearing the cost of that.
All right. Well, that bears watching, I guess. But as you say, I'm sure there'll be more discussion among those two, and we'll do our segment again in a few weeks.
It'll probably get some more lines. We've gotten some pretty good lines from these two. What Abele called Sheriff Clarke an immature bully, a childish bully, and in response, Sheriff Clarke called Chris Abele, said that he was guilty of penis envy. So, I'm expecting many more sound bites from this before it's over.
All right. And it's the first time we've had that phrase on our show, and we'll see what the censors tell us. Let's go now to some questions from viewers, and I'm going to give this first question to Jason. This is from Tell Me More, who says, when will Scott Walker endorse in the presidential race, and will it matter if he does? Do you see him weighing in soon as the field gets smaller? Then you have more of an ability to make an impact.
Right. So, if you look at what the governor talked about throughout his campaign for president, obviously he was running as a governor. He spent a lot of time talking about how governors made the best presidents. Really, at this point, there's no governor left who looks terribly viable. Chris Christie or Jeb Bush are not in terrific position right now. The other candidate that Walker seems fairly close to is Marco Rubio. Scott Walker is clearly opposes Trump. As far as Ted Cruz, Walker has received some help in paying off his own presidential campaign debt from Ted Cruz. So I guess, the question here becomes, is there enough strength being shown by Marco Rubio and enough closeness between Scott Walker and a U.S. Senator to tip the balance there?
Well, we know who he's not going to endorse, and it's Donald Trump. He was at a meeting in Florida that Paul Ryan organized for 40 prominent Republicans to discuss how to beat Donald Trump. So it's going to probably end up being the most viable opponent to Donald Trump, I would guess.
Yeah, let me ask you, Mary, is a Scott Walker endorsement more valuable or less valuable now than it would have been, before he got in the presidential race?
I think it's less valuable now. I mean, he obviously stumbled when he was on the national stage. I think it's valuable in that there are Wisconsin Republicans still trying to decide who to vote for, but I don't know that they're necessarily going to take Walker's word on who that should be. And he obviously got out of, when he said he was getting out on September 21st, he said that he wanted to clear the field for a positive conservative alternative to Donald Trump. That obviously hasn't worked out so well. So, yeah.
No one's paying attention to him so far.
Yeah. So far, no, but that could
And
change.
what percentage of the vote did he have when he dropped out? Less than 1%.
Asterisk.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, here's the big thing that Walker can offer, though. In Wisconsin, he can offer, a very sophisticated network of supporters and operatives to whoever gets in, and it really looks like Wisconsin could be still fairly important for the winner. So that's one thing that any governor can do for another candidate of his or her party. So that would be one thing to watch, at least.
All right, I'm going to give this to Dan because we're going to see if he exceeds expectations on this question. It's a little hard to follow.
We need a
This is
meter
from
like this.
John
No
Bennett,
pressure.
who says, and I'll try to follow. He says, it appears that, despite the outrage of the FBI, that the Justice Department is not going to allow an indictment of Hillary Clinton if the charges are suppressed
person
instead
has
of allowing her
really
to go
good sources.
forward. Yeah, how will she be able to bridge the gap and make herself legitimate to those who think she's guilty? So. You can either try that or just how worried is Hillary Clinton at this point that this shoe hasn't dropped yet? We don't know if it will drop, when it will
it's
drop.
clearly something that's hanging over the race, and each time this thing drips, it's not good for her, and it gives life to the Sanders campaign. I have no idea whether she's going to be indicted, not be indicted, or whatever, but it's clearly not something that she wants hanging over the campaign.
How do you think he did?
Okay.
He did okay. We'll give him another shot on this last one, which I'll ask.
So, did you have an opinion on that?
What? Oh, I thought you did. Oh, you mean on how you did or on Hillary?
Hillary.
Oh, okay. You did fine. On Hillary, I would be surprised at this point if she got indicted. I guess that could change, but I don't know if anything that terrible has come out in the emails of that she was like, aside
But
from
the
using,
22,
right, the yes.
22 classified matters that were dealt with, 22 emails with classified information, that's not a good thing.
No.
And she looked chastened on TV when she was discussing the thing. So I don't know what else could come out of this, but it was a silly and amateurish thing for her to have done.
Right.
All right.
So I guess she could be indicted, but when you think of other things that have
That the Obama administration is going to indict her.
correct, or other things that people have not been indicted for, I just would be surprised if the Obama administration.
All right,
indicts
let's
her.
try our last question here. I'll start with Jason and then come back to the table. This is from someone who's the name is Tired of Politics, who says, what is the best reason to vote in the primary election in a couple weeks? So either you can go for because you're a good citizen, or are there particular races or things that are interesting to you to watch for in the primary? Jason, go ahead.
That's a great question. I guess I would turn it around and say, if you haven't done your homework, why feel like you have to? Because I think the best reason to do it would because, again, you have this opportunity that's been given to you, but if you don't want to use it, then don't.
Jason, you got two thumbs down here in the studio.
Right. Dan,
Don't encourage people not to vote.
What's the best reason to vote?
Because there are a lot of interesting races. You have a Supreme Court race that's competitive and that's out there. The county execs race is an interesting race, even though there are two major candidates. I think you can say the Larson campaign will have to get a good showing in this race. And as Mary's written, there's a number of good aldermanic races going on here. So if you live in Milwaukee County, especially, and if you live in the city of Milwaukee, you have a number of interesting competitive races.
What's the most interesting race you'll be watching for at the primary level?
So we'll be seeing who's going to be challenging Mayor Barrett. A lot of people think that's going to be Bob Donovan, and he's obviously an interesting character and has had lots of colorful news conferences. So that'll be an interesting race to watch. It could be also Joe Davis, who's been trying to do a caravan and drum up community support. Some of the aldermanic races, Donovan's running for 2 seats, so he's running for mayor and running for re-election in his district against Josh Sepnick and a political newcomer who's been doing doors a lot. So that'll be interesting to see is can Donovan, run for mayor and defend his seat at the same time. And then there's just some crowded fields with like 5 or 6 people in a race.
It's a good job for somebody who's looking for it. $70-some thousand plus
Right.
benefits.
Yeah.
So
Better than being in the legislature, which is what, 50,000?
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it
about
is,
that.
All right. Well, we'll leave it
So
there.
the question is why you're not running. No.
I'm not running, or are you? No,
Why we're not running.
Because we get paid so much to be on this show.
Correct.
So we don't need
That is true.
Need the thing. So, all right. Thanks to all our viewers for watching this week. We'll be back next week at the same time. We'll have plenty to talk about with New Hampshire in the books, a Democratic presidential debate here in town, and the primary election on the horizon. So we'll see you next week.